UK Returning to Dance webinar, Considerations for Children and Young People. One Dance UK is the sector support organisation for dance. We are also the subject association for dance in schools, and we also host the Dance Medicine and Science expert panel. One Dance UK is also a partner in the National Institute of Dance, Medicine and Science. The National Institute exists to enhance dancers' health, well-being and performance. And the other partners include Trinity Laban Conservatoire of Music and Dance, the University of Wolverhampton, the University of Birmingham, Birmingham Royal Ballet, the Royal Ballet, and One Dance UK. Today, this webinar will focus on considerations for children and young people returning to dance in relation to relevant UK government guidance. Our topics today will include why dance is perhaps more important than ever, and the issues returning to dance activity in different settings may bring. We will also discuss considerations for practice, including looking at footwear, spacing, groups and bubbles, masks, changing rooms, water and kit, teaching approaches with regard to contact, floor work, traveling, and creative and teaching strategies. At the end of the webinar, we'll also provide an opportunity to ask questions. Please keep in mind the context of these webinars, in that public health is a devolved issue. There will be some references to government guidance in this presentation, and we are being specific to understand which part of the country this guidance is relevant for. Some guidance is relevant for England, other guidance for Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales will vary. You should always consider whether there are local restrictions in place in your local area or region. If so, you should first read the guidance relevant to your area, as this may supersede guidance in this webinar. Also keep in mind that government guidance will evolve with science. No one has all the answers, including us. We are all learning together. As such, we aim to provide a space to discuss, raise questions, identify issues, and share practice. We also aim to provide practical support for implementation of government guidance across the dance sector to help everyone to return to dance safely. We recommend that everyone watching these webinars read the relevant government guidance for your planned work. If you're unsure of which guidance to follow, please seek advice. We also encourage people to use creativity as well as common sense to think about how you will address the requirements set out in the guidance you read. Also consider the resources available personally to you and to your organization, and think realistically about how you can address guidance within those available resources. Finally, we suggest that you discuss ideas with others and test or pilot such ideas to see how they work in practice. A note about how to use this webinar. We ask that all questions be entered into the Q&A box, which is at the center of your screen at the bottom. We will try to address as many questions as possible live during the session, and all of those questions answered during the session will be written up and available on One Dance UK's website. Also keep in mind that you can upvote questions you see in the Q&A box. When you upvote a question, it will allow that question to move nearer to the top of the list to be answered by the panelists. You may also use the chat box to interact with other attendees in the webinar. Our panel today will include Laura Nicholson, Head of Children and Young People's Dance at One Dance UK, Amy Williams, Dance in Education Manager, Tori Drew, Dance in Education Manager, and myself, Erin Sanchez, Health, Wellbeing and Performance Manager at One Dance UK. I will now pass over to Laura Nicholson to introduce the session and give you a bit more information.
Thank you, Erin. And really lovely to see so many people here today. Thank you so much for joining us. So today's session is planned to provide considerations when returning to dance with children and young people. And we know that these activities take place in a huge range of different settings. In schools, sixth forms and colleges, for example, dance is delivered by both teaching staff and by visiting artists and practitioners, and both within the curriculum and as an enrichment and extracurricular activity. Dance is a hugely popular activity with children out of school, in recreational and private dance schools, in community settings, and as part of weekend theatre schools. And across the UK, there are also many wonderful vocational and pre-vocational programmes for children and young people. So all settings are different, and it's vital that all guidance, risk assessments and considerations take place in the context of the unique setting or settings in which you work. The government guidance is complex, to say the least, and is subject to change. And you must also check any local guidance. So moving on to the next slide, I'm sure you'll appreciate that there is no specific government guidance for the teaching of dance to children and young people. We wish that there was. And this means that we have to cross-reference various different pieces of guidance as appropriate for our circumstances. And we also have to keep up to date with any changes to those pieces of guidance. For those of you working in England, there are 4 key pieces of guidance which I would like to draw your attention to and are on your screen now. It's important to note that the guidance for grassroots, sport and leisure points out that where the delivery of that activity is to school-aged children, that guidance does not supersede Department for Education guidance. So we really have to cross-reference them together. Another important note is that the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport guidance for performing arts is aimed at professional context only, and therefore it should be treated with caution when we're looking at that in relation to our work with children and young people. Moving on to the next slide, thanks Erin. So a further important note is that public health, as Erin mentioned earlier, is the devolved issue. So for those of you working in the devolved nations of Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, you must reference the relevant guidance from the nation in which you work. And we are aware that some of you work in more than one of the nations as well, just to complicate things further. Some of those pieces of guidance are shown on the slide that you can now see on your screen. I'd also like to mention that in today's webinar, we are broadly looking at work with children and young people aged 5 to 18. There is additional guidance for early years and for higher education. However, due to time constraints today, we will not be covering that in today's webinar. So moving on to the next slide, please, Erin, thank you. So today's webinar is designed to support you to make the decisions and the changes needed to make a safe return to activity. And we do fully understand that that activity may look very different to the way it has previously been delivered. As the sector support organisation for dance and the Subject Association for Dance in Schools, we advocate passionately and fiercely for the value and the importance of dance. And we recognise an additional factor at play too, that the impact of the pandemic may mean that you're now facing the additional challenge of having to fight and advocate for the place of dance in your organisation. So with that in mind, I would like to spend a few moments reflecting on the current position we find ourselves in as a sector and why here at One Dance UK, we believe dance, as long of course as it is safely delivered, is perhaps more important now than it ever has been. So pre-COVID, the economic downturn and austerity measures since 2010, alongside changes to education policies and accountability structures have, we believe, resulted in decreased dance provision in and beyond schools. One conspicuous example of this is the decrease in numbers of students taking dance examinations in school. There's been an enormous 42% decrease in GCSE dance entries, and an alarming 53% decrease in A-level dance entries since 2010. Looking beyond dance, the Children's Society had already identified that 1 in 10 school children have a diagnosable mental health condition. As a nation too, pre-COVID, we were already dealing with an obesity problem, with 20% of children being clinically obese at the point of leaving primary school. So as we enter the so-called new normal, at the risk of sounding alarmist, we feel that dance could be a subject in crisis. We're concerned that dance may use its place, which was already precarious as part of the school curriculum, as schools focus on catch-up in core subjects and as teaching hours, spaces and funding become more limited. We worry that the infrastructure for dance in the wider community may be further fragmented, with dance teachers and artists leaving the sector and organisations having to reduce their offer and their provision. And the impact of that could be that young people may no longer see dance as a viable career option, impacting on the talent pipeline. In addition to all of that, as if that wasn't enough, we will be returning to working with young people who may have had reduced physical activity during the pandemic. Sport England data tells us that whilst almost 47% of under 16s typically did an hour or more of physical activity per day pre-COVID, this has now fallen to just 19%. 43% of children say that they've done less than half an hour each day since the start of lockdown. And most worryingly, 7% of children ages 7 to 16 said they are doing no physical activity at all at the moment. And finally, we cannot ignore the pastoral context in which we return. I'm sure you'll agree this has been an incredibly stressful and uncertain time for everybody, and that includes the children and young people with whom we work. Some of them will have experienced loss, bereavement, or the illness of a loved one, and all of them have had time away from friends and social activity, and we know that socialising is a skill that children need to practice. So moving on to the next slide, I'm aware that all of that sounds rather gloomy and depressing and probably not what you tuned in for on this Tuesday afternoon. So apologies for that. But the point I hope to make here is a reminder about why it is so important that we work towards a return to high quality dance provision, with of course safety as an absolute priority. Everyone on this webinar knows the huge number of positive benefits of taking part in dance activity. And although on its own it cannot solve a health crisis, dance can certainly play a positive role in developing physical and mental well-being, developing creativity, problem solving, team working, independence, self-expression. I'm sure I could go on, the list is endless. Dance teachers and those providing dance activity for children and young people, without doubt, make up an incredibly creative, resilient, passionate and adaptable sector. You are an amazing and inspiring group of people. This is a rapidly evolving situation, and unfortunately One Dance UK does not have all the answers. We wish that we did. What we can do, and what we hope to do today and going forwards, is to support you to interpret the government guidance. We have to all learn together. That way, by implementing the necessary risk mitigation strategies, which we'll come on to shortly, we can all work together towards ensuring that all children and young people have access to safely delivered, high quality dance experiences, which we know enrich and improve their lives. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Tori Drew. Thank you.
Hi, next slide please, Erin. I'm going to start by looking at groupings and bubbles for children and young people. First of all, England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland return to school guidance all state that students need to be kept in separate bubbles and maintain social distancing. But this of course depends on the children's ability to distance, the layout of the school, and if groups can be kept separate while offering a broad curriculum, especially Key Stage 4 and 5. From this, you can interpret the guidance that dance in schools does need to be socially distanced. The England Full School Guidance outlines that extracurricular clubs, for example, after-school dance clubs, children must be kept within their year groups and bubbles. However, if it's not possible to do this, then you should use small, consistent groups and reference the out-of-school guidance. Now, the out-of-school guidance also recommends the same, that the children are kept in small, consistent groups. However, currently, there's no more than 15 children with 1 or 2 staff members. Schools are able to work with freelance dance artists for curricular and extracurricular activities in the England Full School Guidance, for they say this is allowed. However, this is at the discretion of the school. So some schools may choose to work with freelancers again, some not at the moment. So if you are allowed in the school, please ensure that you keep your distance with staff and students. I am currently looking for further clarification from the Department for Education about those who teach under 5 and those who teach parent and top classes. They have so far recommended that you look to the school guidance, the out-of-school guidance, and early childcare guidance for guidance. However, please keep an eye out on our social media for news about teaching dance to under 5s and parent and top classes. Providers for grassroots sports and leisure and gym guidance states to always reference the school guidance for advice with dealing with children and young people, as Laura said. However, this guidance does state that chaperones to children may wait outside the premises. So if you are running an after-school club or your usual weekend club, you may ask parents to wait outside and that you may consider a risk assessment and plan for how those children will be picked up outside. Next slide, please, Erin. Looking at space, England and Wales return to school guidance state, minimise contact between individuals and maintain social distancing wherever possible. However, it does recognise that it is more difficult for younger children to stay socially distant. Scotland and Northern Ireland return school guidances also note the same, but they note that there should be considerations for blended learning. However, this should be a consideration for all freelancers who may struggle getting back into school from September. If your school says no for you returning back in September, maybe offer like remote learning packages. Can you offer pre-recorded videos? Can you offer like Zoom CPD for the teachers? Think outside the back box. So take into account groupings and bubbles and social distancing. You as a dance teacher need to keep your distance and consider facing away from students when teaching if this is possible. The grassroots and leisure guides recommend markings on a dance studio floor, but in relation to the space you have. Now, there is no specific guidance in the guidance in terms of like, should it be 2 metre by 2 metre boxes with space in between or no space in between? But as a dance teacher, you may want to consider the 2 metre by 2 metre boxes and look at the space and think realistically, how many students can you have in there to maintain social distancing? Remembering that the 2 metre social distance is marked from the centre of the body. If more intense activity and dancing to be carried out as a risk mitigation, you may want to consider having a bigger distance, such as 3 metre distance. For those working with children and young people with disabilities, think about the positioning, colour contrast and size of your distant markers that you use. Maybe consider the use of tactile tape, for example. You may want to provide audio and visual cues for people who cannot see or hear information. For example, producing signs, having videos, using British Sign Language, Makaton or images to help these students with disabilities. For Wales, the regulations do not stop any particular exercise, such as they say you can't dance or can't do this, but indoor studios are still currently closed. However, there are plans to reopen indoor spaces on the 10th of August and more details will be announced soon. Also, from the 3rd of August, they plan to have children not socially distanced who are under 11, and this is for Wales, please remember. Scotland still states that indoor exercise spaces are still closed. Looking at your space, cleaning of the space is good as a good plan for risk mitigation. Everyday cleaning products are fine to use. As a dance teacher in a school, you may want to make sure your school have considered cleaning in between classes when they're timetabling. If you're hiring a venue, the venue is obliged to have a risk assessment and cleaning procedure in place, and you as a freelancer hiring that space can have access to that risk assessment. And maybe you would consider doing your own risk assessment and your own cleaning procedures as an extra risk mitigation as well. Grassroots Sports and Leisure and Gym Guide state that you need to allow for sufficient break time between classes held in studios to appropriately clean the studio equipment if you use it, and also to prevent the waiting outside of waiting groups. In the guidance, there is no set time of how long this break can be. However, UK Active, who, if you're in Northern Ireland, they do recommend that you look at UK Active, that currently in England, the waiting time between classes is a minimum of 10 minutes for England and a minimum of 30 minutes for Northern Ireland. For dance teachers in schools who may lose their studio or may be asked to teach certain classes in the classroom, such as Key Stage 3, you may want to consider other spaces. Can you teach outside? Can you use the sports hall for when PE are not using indoors? Can you use the dining room? However, if you really have to teach in the classroom, maybe you can create a routine of how furniture is moved. For example, Amir moves the table to the left, 1, 2, 3, 4, and Sandra's got the chair 5, 6, 7, 8 to the right. Make it fun, make it part of the dance. Next slide, please, Erin. Bare feet versus footwear. There have been many questions from dance teachers about appropriate footwear for dance in the return to dance. For children and young people, it may be a consideration for bare feet. This is because it's important to note that COVID-19 is a respiratory virus and not transmitted through sweat. However, we realise that bare feet act as an additional touch point. But as a risk mitigation, you can ensure that you clean the floors in between classes, that you maybe ask students to sanitise feet before and after class, as well, of course, sanitising their hands, and keeping those students in their set bubbles will act as another risk mitigation. If you are asking your students to take their shoes and socks off for dance, that you ask them to wash or sanitise their hands after doing so. Bare feet can also be a consideration for children and young people because the virus can also be carried on shoes. Now, some students may have PE and dance on the same day. Therefore, you're asking a student to bring in shoes for PE, shoes for dance, on top of everything else they'll need to bring in for the school day. Will they do this? Well, you as a teacher know your students best and the space best, and you call that judgment based on the interpretation of the guidance. Now, we may want to consider bare feet for children and young people because as a safe dance practice book outlines, it outlines why socks are dangerous for children and young people. Now, this is in terms of injury prevention, in terms of shock absorption, stability and friction, and socks can create slippery patches, which of course is a slip hazard. If you are able to take the dance classes outside or in the sports hall, in the dining hall, or maybe a hall with a hard floor, then please consider suitable footwear. Now, this suitable footwear is just the footwear that the students are used to exercising outdoors and indoors. So just be aware though that floor variability, so the change in use of like going from the dance studio, then next week you're in the school sports floor, rather than the hardness of the floor, has a greater influence on injury. So when you're dancing in another space, maybe consider taking out high impact jumps, for example. Next slide, please, Erin. So, masks and getting out of breath. So far, the webinars, there have been a consideration for teachers to face away from the students if possible and to wear masks while teaching. I recommend that you go and see the previous Q&As from the previous webinars on the type of masks recommended. However, wearing face coverings or masks may impact clear communication, for example, for students who lip read or have a visual impairment. Be aware and ensure that you have other formats available to support communication for those students with disabilities. Consider solutions such as accessible face masks, pre-prepared printed information, or pre-recorded films, or even a notepad to write down notes. Coronavirus safer travel guidance for passengers states that under 11s and those with physical or mental illness, impairment or disability are exempt from wearing a mask. Please note as a dance teacher that your mask, if you are wearing one, will get sweaty, and to avoid the build of a bad bacteria that you need to replace your mask more frequently. Full school guidance states schools should note that there may be additional risk of infection when shouting, such as maybe shouting at your naughty students or shouting over music. For grassroots sports, states refrain from playing music that be loud enough to encourage shouting. This is because of the potential for increased risk of transmission, particularly from aerosol and droplet transmission from shouting. UK active guidance recommend head mics reduce the need to shout. A head mic that's shared between teachers should be cleaned and appropriate between each use. So also please consider the music levels. In terms of droplet transmission, there's been questions around the suitability of getting students out of breath in dance. This is up to the creativity of the teacher. If you can make a dance class technically harder and is it physically easier at the same time, so that's technically harder and physically easier, this will be helping your young students. For example, I'm sure challenging balancing exercises could help. If you are doing higher intensity class, have a shorter one. This is also to do with, as we mentioned at the start of the presentation, children and young people have been doing a lot less during lockdown, and therefore having shorter classes or lower intensity classes will help them work back up to their usual fitness. If you are using high intensity, then ideally you may want to consider the 3 metre distance. Keeping a room well ventilated will help lower the humidity of the room to keep the risk lower. But also you need to remember the risk of a cold studio or a very hot studio. One Dance UK that they recommend that the ideal temperature of a dance studio should be around 21 to 24 degrees, no lower than 18. So you need to be watching this. So, but please be aware when it comes to winter and it's very cold, well, it's even cold today here in the West Midlands, that you need to be watching that temperature, but then watching the risk of transmission with the room humidity. So you need to weigh out these risks yourself and call that judgment. Next slide, please, Erin. Change of rooms, quick kit and equipment. Full school guidance state that classroom-based resources, this is England, can be used and shared within the bubble. These should be cleaned regularly. This means that you could interpret this that the ballet bar can be used as long as it's clean before and after and there's clear spaces at the bar. It's the same with props. If you're working with younger children and you feel you need to use props, then you may consider a prop bucket that children can handle their own props. But I also recommend that you check out People Dancing because they've got a webinar based on dance with younger children and it's all with no props. So in England, if your props or equipment are rotated between the bubbles, that you need to leave them unused and out of reach for a period of 48 hours, and that's 72 hours for plastics. Grassroots sports guides state the use of changing rooms and shower facilities should be avoided where possible, although these must be used for people with disabilities. Northern Ireland Safe Return to Sports Guide state no communal changing or showering is currently permitted. The full school guidance for England recommend that you turn to the Association for PE for advice on physical education. Now, please remember that dance is currently sitting in the PE curriculum. Association for PE have advised that if a changing room is used, they should be cleaned before and after every lesson, that social distance markers are used in that changing room, and also suggest that students attend school with their PE kit. This avoids using the changing room or less time spent in the changing room. Consider not allowing sweat towels in the studio space. The rationale, which is from UK Active, is that there could be a risk of cross-contamination and increased risk of transmission. Someone could use a sweat towel to wipe the sweat off their face and the mouth and then wipe equipment, potentially increasing the risk of transferring the virus. Water fountains are said to be okay, and this again is from the UK Active Guidance. However, schools, studios need to ensure that any water fountains have signage which prohibits face-to-tap drinking, and that these facilities are only used to refill personal bottles. So those in schools, in studios, those freelancers with their spaces, you need to recommend to your students that they're bringing their own water bottles and ideally enough water for the day, the session, and also your dance classes. I'm now going to hand over to Amy Williams.
Hello everybody, it's great to speak to you today. For the next few slides, I'm going to be looking at class content, so specifically the use of contact work, floor work and travelling phrases. And we've chosen to focus on those areas because there's been quite a lot of discussion around them online. And we'll also look at some creative options or considerations that you might want to explore with your children and young people. Again, it's really important to remember those differences in the guidance for those working in professional and non-professional performing arts contexts, and that the information we're discussing today focuses on teaching in non-professional environments. And I just want to emphasise that what we're discussing are considerations, and you need to refer to the guidance for your specific context. Next slide, please, Erin. So firstly, let's look at contact work. And before I get onto contact work in relation to dance, I just want to refer to a point made in a previous webinar regarding first aid. And that's if a student is injured during a session, it is acceptable to provide and administer first aid, and social distancing does not need to be maintained in this instance. Moving on to contact work within a dance context. Current guidance states that outside a professional training environment, contact work is advised against and should be avoided where possible. If you're teaching an exam specification or a syllabus, you might have concerns over whether your students will be expected to create or perform contact work, particularly if that's something that is currently required in the specification or syllabus. You need to refer to guidance from your exam board or dance organisation according to any adaptations that might be made to that specification or syllabus. And for example, those of you that might be teaching GCSE or A-level dance, Ofqual recently held their consultation about changes that might be made to the specifications. The results of the consultation were published yesterday, as I'm sure you've seen, and now the exam board will need to look at what changes should or could be made to their specification. If we consider dance genres where students are required to be in hold, again, in relation to current guidance, you need to consider how this can be avoided until social distancing measures are reduced. Some teachers and dance schools are choosing to focus on technique and building specific skills such as strength over this first term at least. As Laura said, so many dance students won't have been able to engage in their usual level of training. We need to build those skills back up. So could you focus on specific steps and techniques out of hold, ready for when students can return to dancing together? And if we look at an example from a previous webinar, students at London Contemporary Dance School won't be participating in partner work whilst social distancing measures are in place. If we move to the next slide, please, Erin. Let's move on to discuss the use of floor work. Again, referring back to current guidance, remember all touch points, common touch points, should be cleaned regularly. The floor may therefore be considered a common touch point. Now, the guidance doesn't state that you can't do floor work. However, it's just about reducing the level of risk if you choose to include floor work in your teaching. So the floor should be cleaned in between each group using the space, with sufficient time for the floor to dry, ensuring that students aren't dancing on a wet, slippery floor. As we know, many dance genres require students to travel in and out of the floor, and so providing the risks are mitigated, there's no reason that you can't include floor work. However, it still might be wise to consider reducing or limiting the amount of floor work, or you may still decide to avoid it entirely. If you are choosing to include floor work, can you focus on technique? Again, like Tori said, making the movement technically hard, but physically easier. And you will also need to consider students that have physical differences that may mean they have different amounts of contact with the floor, or who may be working closer to the floor. Also consider different types of floor. If you're using a carpeted floor that can't be cleaned easily between groups, this is a further consideration. Another example from a previous webinar at Trinity Larvin Conservatoire, they've stated that whilst they'll be focusing on ballet and Cunningham technique for the first term, they will still be teaching some release technique and floor work, and the steps they've taken to reduce risk include cleaning the floor in between each group and hand sanitising both on the way in and out of the studio. Next slide, please, Erin. If we look at the use of travelling phrases, again, referring back to that guidance, it states that where possible, it is advised to keep socially distanced and within the floor markings. So we're not saying that you should be teaching travelling phrases, we're just outlining what you need to consider if this is something that you decide to do. Students travelling one behind the other, as you might usually do in a technique class, is a possible risk, and it's not advised by One Dance UK's expert panel as discussed in previous webinars. If you are teaching travelling phrases, consider whether students could travel side by side, facing forwards, or a different direction, therefore avoiding moving into the slipstream of another person's breath. You need to consider allowing more time between students travelling through the space, and there are further implications for clothing if travelling work is included due to the risk of droplets landing on clothing. You need to consider, are students able to change their clothing immediately following the session? Consider whether travelling work is necessary at this point in time, and if you feel it is, what steps have you taken to mitigate that risk? Next slide, please, Erin. So if we touch on some points to do with creative content for lessons over the next term at least, I can't emphasise enough, this will be very dependent on your situation, whether you're teaching in a school, in the community, a private dance school or elsewhere, and what rules have been put in place by your school or by your venue. So for example, have your lessons been moved to a different space? Has the length of your session changed? And so on. As I mentioned before, when we looked at contact work, it could be a good idea to focus on developing technique and building specific skills such as strength or flexibility that might have been neglected during lockdown, making those classes technically harder but physically easier. This will help to mitigate the risk, but it should also help to ensure that you aren't just planning tasks that are going to keep the students still, but instead still working towards the skills needed for a particular style, assessment, performance, or examination. If you're teaching from an exam specification or syllabus, consider which parts can be taught most effectively whilst the current guidance is in place, and ensure you're keeping up to date with the latest guidance. We know things are changing day to day all the time. Again, as we mentioned before, if you feel that you need to teach a higher intensity class, can it be shorter in length? In terms of keeping students engaged and motivated, particularly if you might have been used to a different space, such as a classroom, creating shorter projects or mini schemes of work which run over a couple of weeks rather than the typical half-long or term-long scheme might help. Some of you may now be teaching in outdoor spaces, and again, when you're deciding on content, you need to consider what's above and what's below, so the weather and the floor, which of course presents a whole set of other considerations around clothing, footwear and contingency plans, but this still might be the best way to ensure that children and young people in your setting are still having access to dance. If you are teaching outdoors, could you explore considering site-specific dance, or could you think about what styles and tasks might be more suited to outdoor learning? If you're in a different indoor space, such as a classroom, and limited to what you can do by additional spatial restrictions, what might be engaging to teach? And again, this really does depend on your students and your setting. Could you perhaps explore gestural styles? Could you look at storytelling through gestural movement, referring to the styles of professional practitioners? Could you use creative starting points using only one body part, or even using a desk and chair as a prop? And again, refer back to that guidance around using props and the fact that common touch points need to be cleaned regularly. How you design your lesson content will be specific to your students. Some schools may have rules in place where you're dancing in a classroom and those students are still required to be at their desk or be at their chair. And then you might want to consider, will it be engaging them for them to dance, or might they benefit from a different sort of dance project? Again, I'm sure you all know there's a wide array of dance content and performances online, even more so since the start of the pandemic. Could you use this to your advantage if you're in a classroom setting? Could it be an opportunity to explore seated dance? If you're working with Key Stage 3, could you do preparatory work that might prepare students for the study of dance at Key Stage 4? Or that might feed into practical work later in the school year should the guidance be changed or the rules in your school be changed. As dance teachers, you're also exceptionally creative, so just consider different approaches to your usual topics, or embrace this as an opportunity to try something different. In education, we usually see students participating in a vast array of different tasks, including pair and group work. This term may need to be more prescriptive, and could be the time for more teacher-led work where you're teaching a routine directly onto the students. This might not be how you would choose to teach, but in the short term, this still provides an opportunity for children and young people to engage in high quality dance whilst maintaining sufficient risk mitigation. And if we think again about the use of space, if you are using floor markers or a grid to help students maintain social distancing, could this actually be part of the topic or task? Next slide, please, Erin. And just a few final points to consider before we move to questions. Laura mentioned at the start that the Children's Society have identified that children and young people's mental health is now at crisis point, and there is a need for pastoral and wellbeing support. We all know dance is an emotive, expressive subject, so consider whether your lessons could be used as an opportunity for students to explore and unpick their experience of lockdown and the last few months. As Tori mentioned previously, if you're a freelance artist that usually delivers in a school setting, you may find that some schools aren't having those external visitors, and it does vary from school to school. This doesn't necessarily mean that those schools don't want any dance provision, so think about how you can make your content and teaching accessible to those schools. Video packages, resources, etc. And primary schools in particular have sport premium funding that can be spent on this sort of provision. If you're thinking about planning for extracurricular dance or creative performance work, again, you need to look at what your school or your venue has put in place and refer to the specific guidance in relation to that. And as a final consideration, none of us know what's going to happen later this year. It's changing day by day, week by week. So within your planning, can you consider putting contingency measures in place? Should we have restrictions relaxed further at some point? Or if measures were to be strengthened again. I'm going to pass back to Laura now, and then I think we've got time for some questions.
Thank you, Amy. Yeah, we do. We've got lots of questions coming in, so we'll get straight on. So this first one, I'm going to pass to Tori, if that's okay, Tori. So the question is, any advice about moving students from the bar to the centre in terms of cleaning?
So, sorry, can you clarify that question? So it's in terms of cleaning?
Yeah, so moving students from the bar to the centre.
All right, so again, we cannot say do this and don't do this because there's nothing in the guidance about the ballet bars or how you structure your class. However, when they're saying cleaning prop equipment like before and after use, you might consider that, is that the use of when you're at the bar and then you go to the centre? But I think maybe consider as a teacher, it's probably best to clean at the end of the class. I say this because, you know, the air droplets in the air, they're landing, they're bouncing off the wall and falling, and bars tend to be on the side. So are you, as a teacher, doing the cleaning yourself? Are you getting the student involved if you had older students? But again, I can't say yes or no. Make it part of the dance routine if you're talking about the actually like moving from the bar. Okay, again, you got like Billy, you're 1, 2, 3, 4. Sally, you're a 5, 6, 7, 8. But yes, I hope this kind of helps in any kind of answering of the question.
Great, thank you. And then I've got a couple of questions which I'm going to group together, and Erin, they're going to come your way if that's okay, because it may link to some of the content from previous webinars, both around cleaning. So the first question is, for cleaning floors, can we use a Dettol type spray between classes, or do we need to mop? And the second question is, are foggers recommended to sanitise studios between classes?
So relative to that first question, the guidance has indicated that regular cleaning products are what's recommended. So if you usually mop your floor, that would be the way that you should clean it between classes. If you usually use Dettol on the floor, you can also do that. I would remind you of what Amy talked about in terms of the slip hazards of cleaning the floor between classes and ensuring that any product that you're using on the floor isn't going to increase the slipperiness or the stickiness of the floor in a way that could potentially cause injury for your participants. The other thing to think about in terms of cleaning the floor is that you may want to clean the edges of the floor as well as the center of the floor. Previous webinars have discussed the possibility that there may be a greater landing of droplets towards the edges of the room and the edges of the floor. Although this is not something that is in the guidance anywhere, and I would stress that because it's not in the guidance, it's not required, but it may be a consideration for you to think about cleaning the edges of the floor as well as the center. In terms of the second question about foggers, we've had quite a number of questions about foggers and whether or not those are recommended. Unfortunately, there isn't any information in the guidance about whether or not those are a good tool to use. The guidance only states that ventilation should be maximized where possible. And I think for the purposes of our suggestions and possible considerations you might make, it's best to try and think about ventilation first. There isn't any clear indication from the DCMS or the government about foggers.
Thank you, Erin. Another one coming to you, Tori, if that's okay. So it's around numbers. So the question's from Charlotte, who works with disabled young people. So she's asking, when working with disabled young people who also need a carer, do the numbers need to be even lower? So I guess we're considering whether the carers count in the numbers and the ratio of that bubble.
Yeah, great question. And I'm just going to guide Charlotte to the full school guidance, but the SEND school guidance. And in that guidance, it does state that, you know, there is the need for the carers there. And also it is understandable that those carers can't actually keep the 2 metre distance. It says usually in those SEN settings, you have smaller classes anyway. So this acts as its own risk mitigation. But if you're referencing like your own school, your own SEN disability dance class, then you're thinking, which guidance do I follow? I would cross-reference, as we've been saying, cross-reference with the SEND school guidance with the out-of-school guidance and consider other risk mitigations. Even the SEND one does say, because your carers and students will be close together, consider the face masks, maybe the gloves, other risk mitigations that you'll have. So I can't give you an answer in terms of how many, but usually those SEN settings would have fewer students anyway. I hope this answers your question.
Thanks, Tori. And we've got 2 questions from Sarah, which I'm going to have a go at answering. So the first one is around, can out-of-school settings activity happen from September? Current guidelines are only for the summer holidays, or is that just something to wait for? As far as I'm aware, the guidance on out-of-school activity at the moment just runs up until the end of the summer holidays. We are anticipating that there will be some updated guidance on that, and it's likely that activity will continue. The updated guidance will allow activity to continue, but with all of these things, it seems to be a bit of a waiting game and watch this space. So at the moment, the guidance does only take us through to the end of the summer holidays. And the other question from Sarah is around blended learning. So is blended learning the same as a hybrid offer? Yes, so blended learning, hybrid learning, we love to throw these names and words around, don't we, in education. So yeah, having a mix of in-person provision and online provision. And we're finding lots of organisations are sort of making a contingency plan that allows for sort of best case scenario, kind of business as usual, through to a completely online offer if there should be a local lockdown. So good practice would be that you have a range of possibilities that would suit what is going on in your local area and in the country at that time, that uses a mix of online and in-person provision. Coming back at you, Tori, I'm working you hard today. So this question is around the numbers in a studio or building, even when teaching children and young people. So should we be following gym ventilation guidelines around 100 square foot per person, especially if you run a studio or hire a community centre?
Yeah, good question. And it's all about your setting and situation. Let's say you are lucky enough to own your own dance studio. You're a lucky person, got your own dance studio. Then you need to look for that grassroots sports gym and leisure guidance, because you need to work out how many is allowed in the building. Now, this is to do with ventilation. So to work this out, you've got your dance studio, how many square foot is it, and you divide it by the 100 square foot. So this should work out how many is allowed in the studio. If you have any confusion about this, turn to UK Active, and they've got like some questions and guidance about that. However, let's say you're a freelancer, again, lucky, you're a freelance dance artist, what a wonderful career, and you're hiring out a space. Now, the person or venue you are hiring it from, it's their responsibility to tell you how many is allowed in the studio, or like how many is allowed to be in the building. It's their responsibility to work out, actually, I can have this many in my venue. Now, it also takes into account changing rooms, waiting areas, reception areas. So they might tell you when you go back to using your dance space, actually you're only allowed so many in your dance class, because, you know, we've got our office staff in there, we've got the cleaner over there. So it depends on your situation. Dance studio, your own studio, yes, you need to take that into account. If you're hiring a space, you need to ask, say, how many would I be allowed in this room in terms of like the overall building. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. And this one's for you, Amy. It's around first aid. So Jane is asking if you could confirm requirements around first aid, please.
Hello, that's a really good question, Jane. Yep, so basically, if you need to administer first aid, if there is a situation that takes precedence and you aren't expected to necessarily maintain social distancing in that circumstances, obviously, it depends on the severity of the situation. If you can keep your distance, if you can instruct the injured student to do certain things without getting closer to them, that is better. If you can get a mask, if you can get gloves, but ultimately, the first priority is dealing with that incident. So you can administer first aid and don't need to maintain social distancing in that instance. I hope that helps.
Coming straight back at you again, Amy. So Amanda's asking around the bubble idea. If she's a lone dance teacher running a dance school, does she have to just teach one group? If she teaches multiple groups, is she then the link between the groups and a possible spreader of contamination?
That's a really great question. I know there's been so much discussion around this. You can teach different bubbles. So what's really important that is, if you are the person teaching the different bubbles, you are maintaining that social distance. So keeping that 2 meters apart, considering further risk mitigation, such as wearing a mask or a visor, teaching facing away from the students. You mustn't pop the bubbles. So if you're getting closer than that to those students in that bubbles, that's when we're going to start to see that risk increase. And obviously it's down to your personal risk assessment about whether you want to be teaching different groups of students and how you can manage that. We can't say you should just teach one or anything like that. It's about the risk mitigation and keeping that distance to reduce the risk there. I hope that's clear.
Thank you. Erin, I'm going to pass this one over to you, if I may. So Anne-Marie's question is around the use of face coverings, face masks from the 8th of August, when the rule comes in that face masks have to be used in most indoor settings, whether that also applies to teachers teaching in community settings.
Yeah, and this is a question that we also have, and unfortunately we haven't had any clarity about whether or not the masks are going to be required in indoor spaces in the context of dance. Currently, still in line with the previous situation of the guidance, there is no requirement, no mandatory ask of the government to wear a mask, whether you're a teacher or a dancer, whether you're working in a non-professional or a professional setting. We would suggest a risk mitigation strategy, as Amy just mentioned. It's useful to help reduce the chances of transmission, but it is not required now as yet. But if there are any changes to that, the government will announce it, and we'll definitely be posting about it on social media and on our website.
Thank you, Erin. And what I would add to that is, although the question was around teaching in community settings and not in schools, I would say for teachers in schools, the Department for Education guidance usually trumps any other guidance. Likewise, any guidance from your employer must be adhered to as well. So if you are in a school setting, please, of course, check the Department for Education guidance and any specific guidance from your school or your multi-academy trust that you're working in. I'm going to take this question as well from Krishna. So Krishna asks, because of social distancing, we need to increase the number of hours we hire a community hall. Is there any financial support available for this by the government? I can't answer that question specifically. I'm not aware at this moment in time of any specific pots of money for that, but we would direct you to the government website, and they do quite clearly list all the support that is available for businesses and for individuals as well. So we would direct you over there to have a look at what is currently available. If I can pass this question to Amy, which is from Jill. So do you feel that recognised dance teaching associations may now adapt their syllabi?
That's another really good question. Unfortunately, one I can't give a definitive answer on. What I would advise you to do is go to your dance organisation or awarding body or exam board, and they should be able to provide you with guidance on this, and if they are going to make any adaptations to that syllabi. So I would advise you to get into touch with them.
Thank you. And I think we may have time just for one last question. So coming back to you, Tori, this is a question linking to bubbles. So can I teach a number of different classes on the same day in a school? So can Eve come into contact with different bubbles of children as long as she maintains social distance?
I'm guessing that you're talking about the same school. It's at the school's discretion, as Laura said. The school, as the employer, top trumps everything. The DfE top trumps everything. And DfE's return to school guidance says that outside visitors are allowed, and it's at the school's discretion. So if the school is saying yes, you can, yes, you can. And also make sure, like as Amy said, don't pop that bubble, keep your distance. Now, if you're talking about going into different schools, again, that's at the school's discretion. And we've been hearing from the sports sector about this going on in terms of like return to school for some students from June. This has been going on, but it may be that you take the responsibility of risk mitigations yourself. How are you not going to be the spreader? Making sure you keep distance, you know, the wearing the mask, washing your hands regularly, and also it may be polite to maybe tell the school, saying I'm working at these schools, and making sure that the bubbles you are teaching are consistent. You're not going from year 7 one week, next week you're doing another bubble. Try and keep with those same consistent bubbles. Thanks.
Great, thank you. I'm sorry that we didn't manage to get through everybody's questions, but we will do our best to answer those and to share responses. So thank you so much for all your questions today. And I'm now going to hand back to Erin. Thank you.
So this is just a little reminder to everyone to let you know that we have a few more webinars in this series about returning to dance that are coming up this week and next week. This week on Thursday, we'll be addressing physical and mental preparation for returning to dance, specifically looking at mental health and injury management. So we've discussed a lot in this webinar about the fact that many children and young people, and generally speaking, teachers and all those who work in dance, will perhaps not have been doing their normal activities for quite a long time. And as such, it's really important to think about mental health and also about injury prevention as a part of returning to dance. On Friday, we'll be addressing a topic that we also talked about a little bit today, which is about alternatives to face-to-face activity. So exploring outdoor activity, blended learning, and the additional consideration of addressing digital poverty. And on Friday, we'll be discussing physical and mental preparation for returning to dance in terms of nutrition and fitness. So sorry, that's next Friday. And then in the future, as soon as the government guidance is released on this, we'll be addressing transport, touring, and travel. I also wanted to signpost a couple of additional places where you can find information and resources about the dance sector. Particularly the People Dancing website is a really wonderful resource. They have excellent resources, including an example risk assessment, an accident form that you can use as a template. They also have a really easy to read overview of government guidance, which if you've never read it before, I would highly recommend it. It's just very useful. They also have a webinar coming up this Thursday from 2 to 3 p.m. looking at dance and physical distancing in and beyond primary school settings. And that's with Louise Jaggard, Claire Pring, and Joe Cohn. That's going to be a great webinar. I know we're all going to be tuning into it, so I would certainly recommend that you do as well. It also might be worth checking out the Council for Dance, Drama, and Musical Theatre, which provides some really useful e-booklets both on professional schools and vocational training, as well as graded exams and practical lessons. If you haven't seen these resources, they're really good advocacy documents if you're trying to convince your school or organization to include dance. They have some really great information in there about why dance is important. I would also recommend that you look at a couple of other organizations, and particularly organizations that dictate your practice. So whether that's an awarding body or Sport England or the Sport and Recreation Alliance, there are a lot of really good resources on different websites. I've listed a few here, but there are a number of different resources for members of different organizations. So if your organization is offering information for members, I would recommend that you access it. I'd also recommend that if you don't know what your organization is offering, that you get in touch with them. So that's all from us here at One Dance UK. I'd like to thank everyone for attending this workshop and for all of your really useful questions. We're looking forward to seeing you at a future webinar, and we hope that you have a wonderful day. Thanks, everyone.